Thank you, Duncan. I'm well aware that at least a good proportion of the audience today is also well published. And we've also got some people who have not published. So to the latter, I hope this will be useful. And to the former, you can have a little sleep, because everything I'm going to say is probably very familiar. But the first thing to say is that there are lots of opportunities to get your research out there. And although I'm going to focus on the scientific literature and the scientific journals, think about other journals and other possibilities as well, because it depends on what you have to say and who you want to say it to. So your target group may be more relevantly reached through something like a professional journal, for example. And I put up Nursing Times as an example. I think that has a huge circulation. Handbooks, books are also another way of publishing in chapters if you're new to publishing. I'm going to concentrate, though, on the peer-reviewed journals, because if you're in the academic sphere and you want to publish, that's regarded as the gold standard, and it's publish or die sometimes. So what do you find in the scientific publishing sphere? You find the original papers, the results of your research. You find also reviews, systematic reviews, meta-analysis. You can get editorials, which are often well cited. They comment on research, they contextualize findings, they talk about policy or recent debates, and they can be very publishable. You also get letters, which can be a good way of putting out a few small findings that you may have, or a critical commentary on somebody else's findings. They're all very legitimate ways of publishing. And then in some journals, you get a whole range of possibilities for short news items, commentaries, journal, book reviewing, and so on. So there are ways in which you can break gently into the publishing scene if you're new to it. If you're doing a research paper, then often there's a sort of formula that you have to follow, and I won't go through it in detail, but you've got the title, abstract, and the keywords, and the main thing there is to make sure that when somebody's searching for young people and alcohol use, your paper is going to pop up. Then you've got your introduction, your methods, your results, and your discussion. So that has to be very informative, but as concise as possible, not rambling on about everything. And then finally, your conclusions, which have to be linked to your findings. And it's surprising how many papers I read where the conclusions go off at a tangent. Your acknowledgements to everybody who's helped you, and even if they haven't helped you, you need to name them. And then, of course, your references and your conflict of interest. So I won't go through it, but there's plenty of formula such as that, and you usually get instructions from the journal about what they expect. So what are the key steps to get you there? First of all, you've got to choose which journal you're going to submit to, and that's really important. I'll talk about that in a minute. The second step is to prepare your work for the journal that you've chosen and submit it to that journal. And then the third important step is responding to reviewer comments and revising the paper. And I've put that together because it's very rarely that you won't have to revise the paper. And then the final bit of advice there is keep trying. That for some reason that little picture reminds me of Nicola Sturgeon. It wasn't chosen deliberately. Okay, so if you're in the addictions world, you'll find that there are an increasing number of journals that you can submit to. So you can see from that graph how they've gone up since 1950, up and up and up. Most of them as well are in English, so we're really lucky. We don't have to struggle with the problem of language. So, but consider the range of journals when you're thinking about where to submit. The addictions are the obvious ones in our field, but you may find that a discipline is better, social science and medicine, social policy, critical public health. These are good journals, and they may be totally appropriate for whatever it is that you want to publish or say. Then you've got to think about, well, what's your material like? Is it just relating to Scotland or the UK? Does it have international significance and interest? And that can influence what journal you choose as well. Some journals are perfectly happy to have UK-based research findings. Other journals want you to broaden it out and have more international context. So look at that issue. Then there are a lot of things related to the journal. The impact factor, we all know about that. The impact factor is how many times the papers in the journal have been cited by other papers over the previous 2 years. Impact factor shouldn't be the only or the main reason for choosing a journal, but it's something to keep in mind, and it's sometimes looked at by your university, or if you're going for a job, you know, people will see you've published in high impact journals. So keep it in mind, but don't make it necessarily the main thing. Look also at things like the circulation. Who's this journal being circulated to? How many readers does it reach? What's its acceptance rate? Some journals, which you might love to publish in, have a very low acceptance rate. So you can send off your paper and it might be a really good paper, but it's in competition, just as your research proposals are. We had a workshop on that this morning. It's in competition with other papers for the space in the journal. So it could be turned down, even if it's a good paper. Then you want to look at time for publicate to publication. So you can submit your paper and it takes quite a while for it to come out, at least in the hard copy. It can take up to a year or even more with some journals. Some journals have first online, so as soon as it's accepted, it goes up online and it's available, and that's good. Look at what the journal says its aims and focus are. No point sending something to a journal which is not really relevant to what you're writing. I, for example, used to get papers which were on drugs for veterinary surgeons. And this was in, our drugs education, prevention and policy. And you wonder if they've even looked at what the journal takes. So you don't want to get into that problem. You could also look at the editorial board. That can tell you something about the journal's focus, the types of things that they do, the sorts of people who will be looking at your paper and reviewing it. Might give you a little hint about who you should quote in your papers as well. Then think about what the journal wants. It's not just what you want, but journals have needs as well. They've got status, kudos. They want to be thought of as good journals. They want citations. And some things are really welcomed by journals. For example, a review is often welcomed, if it's a good review, because that will get a lot of citations. Large quantitative studies, meta-analyses, these are also favoured by journals, which doesn't mean to say that the qualitative studies are not up to standard and don't get lots of citations sometimes. But think about what the journal wants and what it publishes. You can look at their papers that they've published and see something of that. Then there's open access. Now, open access is a good thing, and more journals are doing it, and you usually have to pay something to get your paper open access. It can be very expensive. Some journals are $2,500 roughly for open access. But what you've got to beware of is what's called, or been called recently, predatory publishers. I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to leave it for the minute because I've got a slide coming up on that. Then you want to have a list of possible journals in order of preference. So you put your really top one at the top, and it might be one that you think, well, they haven't got a good acceptance rate, but I'll give it a go. And that's fine. But then have your fallbacks, your plan B and your plan C. And there's nothing wrong with the journals that will be in plan B and plan C. It's okay. But that means you've something to go to if your paper's turned down. Then if you're in doubt, if you're doubtful, does my paper fit this journal? Have I used the right kind of format? Is there something that I should be doing in particular? Contact the editor and ask questions. It doesn't do any harm, and they will answer you. Try, if you want to build a little relationship with the editor and be proactive. As an editor, once you've developed a relationship with somebody, particularly if you think it's a young person just beginning, it's really difficult then to turn their paper down. You almost get caught into a vicious circle of trying to help them to get it published. So it's worth giving that a go. It depends on the editor, but I'm a bit of a sucker, and I always have been, for trying to get people through the process. Right, going back to predatory publishing. This term was coined by somebody called Jeffrey Beal in America. And what it relates to is the fact that more and more online journals are springing up, and they're offering to publish your paper, sometimes for quite a sturdy fee. They are also approaching people like me and various other people on other editorial boards and asking us to be on their editorial board. You get one almost every week. It's amazing. Or will you submit a paper? We've read your excellent paper on, and then they ask you to submit a paper to a journal that's nothing to do with what you write about. But it's called predatory publishing, and you have to beware of them. It means that they are companies which are engaging in questionable practices, so they're often not peer-reviewed. They will accept your paper even if it's a load of rubbish. Now, I did take a little clip from, there's a reference at the end to this. Somebody called Davis submitted an article with nonsense text and fictitious authors who were all listed as being related to a non-existent centre called Centre for Research in Applied Phrenology. The author received a letter from the editor of an e-journal, Open Information Science Journal, stating that the article had been accepted for publication after peer reviewing process. A publication fee of $800 was requested, and the address to send it to was the United Arab Emirates. So that's quoted by Davis. In another case, a science writer submitted a faked and fabricated cancer article to 305 online journals. The authors of the article received 157 acceptance letters and only 98 rejections. Now, it was absolute rubbish what they were writing. The author of that did say he wondered if without would they have had a different response from peer-reviewed journals? Well, we hope they would, although sometimes things do get through even the peer-reviewed journals. But that's just to sort of alert you to the fact that these things exist. So the next step, preparing your work for the chosen journal. First of all, very obvious thing, follow the instructions for the author and revisit if you submit to a second journal after a rejection. We get things and we look at it and we say, oh yeah, this was sent to Addiction. First of all, Addiction turned it down and they've just banged it off to us. They haven't bothered to look at our format and how we want things submitted. That doesn't put you in a good place for putting the editor in a good mood. Proofread carefully and ask yourself if everything you've put in there is needed, the tables, the figures. Space counts in publishing. Each journal has a limited amount of space because it costs money to produce it. Even the online journals are a bit sticky about their space. So if you have stuff that's padding, it's not going to go down well. Making sure that things are correct, that you can check references, all the details are there, and it's in the format of the journal. These are all very obvious things, but you'd be surprised how often they go wrong. Acknowledge funding sources along with any other acknowledgements that you have to have. And quite often now, journals are asking for conflict of interest statements. Sometimes that gets published, sometimes it doesn't. And they will tell you what they want for their conflict of interest statements. It's well worth it to ask somebody to read your paper and comment on it before you send it. Again, a really obvious point, but it picks up on all these very irritating little typos that you haven't noticed because you've read your paper 50 times already. Then authorship is tricky, and I'm not going to talk at that yet because I'll come to that in a minute, but it's a really important point. Okay, so the sort of final stage in your preparation is to murder your darlings. Now, this comes really from the creative writing sphere. My daughter's a creative writer, and she said whenever you go on a creative writing course or program, the first thing they tell you is murder your darlings. And we know the feeling. You've got this lovely bit that you've put into your paper. It has beautiful quotations. You've spent ages. You really like it. You think it's important. But actually, a reviewer might think, nah, they've gone off tack. It's a bit redundant. Why do you need 3 quotations when you can make do with 1? So have a look at your paper and say, is this just something that I'm in love with? And can I get rid of it? So authorship, the important issue that can cause a lot of stress, particularly for PhD students, new researchers, and teams that are not getting on terribly well. So the first thing to do about this is, if you can, at the start of your project or at the start of discussing publication, discuss who's going to do what, who's going to lead which paper, and who's going to link in, so that you've got it perfectly clear. It could change in the course of writing and working, somebody might get ill or whatever, but at least you've got a clear plan to start with. So, who should be the first author? It's really important, if you're a PhD student or a young early career researcher, that you don't meekly hand over your work to somebody else on the team who, would like to be first author, and they say, well, I'm the PI or whatever it is, I got the money in, so I should be first on the paper. Then who should be included? Sometimes you think, should I include that person? They made the tea. But making the tea isn't a good enough reason for being included on your paper. So you have to have a think about what are the criteria for inclusion on the paper. And what's the order of authors? That again is difficult. If you think everybody's made a fairly equal contribution, then alphabetical order, or backwards alphabetical, which never happens. And since I'm Thom, and I'm always at the end, whatever I've done, then I would quite like a backwards one sometimes. Anyway, then the other sticky problem, particularly for younger researchers, is, do I have to add the professor? I think this is Sigmund Freud, and I'm not really sure if he ever was a professor, but anyway, because the reasoning is, well, he did get the funding. He's a famous person. It could be she's a famous person. And I do need to keep in the good books of the professor. And then maybe it'll help get the paper accepted. Well, it won't, because again, sometimes you get a paper in, it's not well written, it's not well structured, but it's got a well-known professor's name at the end of it. And you think, did this professor read the paper? And the answer is no, they've just been stuck on it. So it's another way of, not getting your paper published. But do think about that and discuss if you've got a professor that you're working with, what role they should take in the publication of your paper, particularly if it comes out of your PhD. I won't say any more about that. Now, there are good guidelines about authorship that if you're ever in a sticky position, you can look up and quote at your team or at your colleagues if you have to, or you can look at them before you actually take the decisions. So, as I said, early agreement on the precise roles and contributions. And you can contribute back to the conceptualization, to the theory, to the collection of data, to doing a really sturdy commentary on the paper so that you look for all the problems. There are lots of ways people can contribute. Then the award of authorship should balance intellectual contributions to the conception, the design, analysis and writing of the study. against the collection of data and other routine work. So it is a value judgment. I mean, is collection of data just routine work that merits less than the conceptualization and the theoretical input? I don't know. That's a judgment that's up to you to do, and it can be very unfair on those who are seen to be doing routine work. So you have to think about it. It's a question that comes up as well when you're working, for example, with clinical or people in services, and they've made a good contribution. Should they be on your paper? So they should not be forgotten and should be included in the discussion. If there's no task that can reasonably be attributed to a particular individual, then that individual should not be credited with authorship. So you can't just stick people on because they're your pal or you think it might be useful in the future. All authors are supposed to take public responsibility for the content of their paper. So wherever you are on that paper, whatever your position, you're supposed to be able to stand up, and if somebody asks you questions about the paper, to be able to defend it, to talk about it, to say how you arrived at the conclusions and so on. You are also responsible, whatever your part in it was. The multidisciplinary nature of many research studies can make it difficult, of course. And sometimes, if there's quite a statistical study that I'm involved in, and my statistician's not there, and somebody asks a question, I have to just honestly say, look, I think this is what the answer is, but I will check up on it for you, because you can't know everything. It can be resolved by the disclosure of individual contributions as well. And some journals are asking for that. They're saying you have to list what each individual has contributed to the paper. Right, 5 minutes. Authors should not allow their name to be used merely to add credibility. That's the professor. Okay, submit. Now, do not submit to the same paper to more than one journal at a time. That seems obvious, but it did actually happen to us. Someone submitted a paper, we sent it for review. The reviewer said, hey, I got this paper from another journal. What's going on here? Luckily, it was a young researcher, and as I said, I'm pretty kind to those people. And so we just alerted them, and they withdrew it from the other journal. Add a cover letter to the editor. You've got to sell your paper a little bit. Most cover letters, people just say, I would like to submit this paper on. But if you add a little bit more and just say, we are highlighting some exciting new findings, or whatever it is, or this is a really good critique of the policy that's just come out, then that helps and the editor gets interested. So what happens after that? I think you all know. It goes through the peer review process. The editor can dismiss it straight away for a whole multiplicity of reasons. Then it's usually sent to 2 to 3 reviewers, and finding reviewers can be hard, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And generally it's blind reviewing, so you won't know who the reviewer was, although you can sometimes guess. Timescales for receiving a response can vary. So if you think it's taking too long, if it's more than a couple of months, email the editor and say, hey, what's happened to my paper? But do it politely, of course. Say you're anxious or something like that. Then the decision comes back. Reject, okay. Major revision, minor revision, these are the common ones. Accept, hardly ever. Now, I've put that little man with the question marks because if you get reviewer comments coming back and you don't know what they mean, or you think, well, if I do what this reviewer asks me to do, it's going to add, another 1,000 words to the paper and I'm at the word limit, get in touch with the editor. And again, check up on anything you don't know or anything you want to ask about. I won't go through this. I was giving you an example of a really awful review that we had to one of our papers where the reviewer did not understand, didn't read what we'd said. It was about it was an evaluation of a government programme and rejected it. There were 2 other reviews which were fine, not too bad, and we submitted it somewhere else and got it published, of course. So common reasons for rejection, I won't go through it in detail because I know I'm on near the limit. It doesn't contribute to knowledge or methods. The methods are unsound. The size of the data set's not defended. Terribly small data sometimes gets refused. Analysis have to be properly described. The conclusions, as I said before, have got to flow from your findings. There's no point going off at a tangent and in your recommendations and conclusions if it doesn't relate to what you found. It doesn't address the topic of the research, poorly written or structured, too long, and ethical issues have not been properly addressed. Responding to reviewer comments. Stay cool is the best advice, really. Your first reaction is probably, oh no, and get angry or depressed. Read the reviews, wait a couple of days, and then you'll be calmer and you'll feel more like really taking account of what they're saying. Remember that some reviewers have a hobby horse. The thing I didn't read to you was a hobby horse. They may not know your topic terribly well, but they do generally try to be constructive. So have a think about what they're saying. Decide which of the comments are maybe helpful and appropriate. And you might find that some of them you feel, well, they're not appropriate. I really can't do that, or I don't want to for some reason. As I said, clarify with the editor if you're not sure, and revise the paper according to the journal instructions and the reviewer comments. Then write a good response to reviewer comments. Be polite. Don't say this reviewer has made a stupid suggestion. And we do get these. We've also had things where they've been really, really angry letters, as say, why are they saying this about my paper? I'm a well-known person, and I've written X number of papers on this topic. This is not relevant comments. You should be publishing my paper. And I'm not joking, we've had ones like that. So never write an angry complaint to the editor because it won't work. It's likely to go in the bin, even if you insist on going to appeal, which some have done and gone to the publisher. You won't get anywhere. So be cool, revise, take account of the sensible suggestions and put down good reasons why you're not going to take account of other suggestions. So, final bit of advice, join them. Build up experience of scientific publishing by offering to review for a journal. And I made that comment once. Thankfully, I'm no longer an editor. But when I was, the next day I got an email saying, please, can I come on the board of your journal? And of course, I had to let her on. And she turned out to be really good. Look as well for opportunities to join an editorial board, not maybe immediately, but a little way down the line. So if you know any editors, know any editorial board members, tell them you're interested and ask them to keep you in mind. And you never know, you might be there one day. So these are sources that you can use, good sources, and I've relied a lot and always do on the Ice Age publications, and there's a lot more on their website, which really help you with all the issues that I've been talking about and a lot more instead. Thank you.
This is probably a situation that many authors have faced, and when you have quite contradictory comments from different reviewers, the old reviewer 3 who never seems to like your work. Do you have any advice for authors about how to deal with these contradictory comments?
Yeah, well, really it's the job of the editor to do that. Really, the editor ought to look at the reviews that come back. Now, sometimes there's only 2 reviews because, you can't find a reviewer. If one reviewer says this is a decent paper, it needs some revision, but it could go through, and the other reviewer says, well, I don't like this paper because, and I don't think it should be published, the editor's got a bit of a dilemma. So a normal practice would be to send it to a 3rd reviewer and to see what the 3rd reviewer says. And that can tip the balance. Now, if it doesn't, really it's the editor's decision. Sometimes they can call on another editor if it's a really difficult situation. But actually it's the editor's decision. And when the reviews go back to the author, quite often you'll find you get the 2 or the 3 reviews, and you'll also get a commentary from the editor, which gives you a hint about which comments on the reviews you should pay attention to as the most important. Now, if the editor does that and you're asked to resubmit, even if it's substantial revision, do so, because it means that the editor hasn't rejected it. They haven't gone with the reviewer who says it's an awful paper. So then you've got, the pathway to keep going.
Yeah.
Thanks, Betsy. For people working in universities, we have the ref, and so X number of publications, etc., etc. But also being asked about impact, and I don't mind about that because kind of in policy areas that's important to me. But one of the suggestions a lot of people have received from the universities is that we should now include as authors people from industry, or if the project was funded by the NHS, include them as an author, because then whoever is reviewing the paper somehow would say, that's got impact because it includes other people. So I wonder from your perspective as an editor or past editor of DPP, what do you think of that kind of advice?
I would say that's bad practice. But it would be quite relevant to put them in the acknowledgements and say we've been supported and assisted by, and you put them in there and they've contributed in such and such a way, if they have contributed anything at all. That's how I would do it. But I think that's not good practice. A paper is supposed to have a contribution to the research, to the paper, and not just, somewhere in the background. So I'd be a bit wary of it as an editor.
Thank you, Betsy.